Detente. Isn't that what a farmer has with his turkey? Until Thanksgiving? Ronald Reagan.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we'll take a look at American international relations in the 1970s. The Cold War dominated U.S. foreign policy concerns from the late 40s to the early 1990s. The 40s and 50s witnessed a massive military buildup and widespread espionage between the United States and Soviet Union. In the early 1960s, the two sides teetered on the brink of nuclear war, before a hot proxy conflict in Vietnam commanded the attention of the superpowers. The Vietnam War lasted into the 1970s, during which decade tensions finally began to simmer. Today, we'll take a closer look inside the 1970s and the relative easing of tensions between communist and capitalist nations. But before we do, let's ask a big question. Should the United States strive to defeat its enemies or coexist with them? To war or not to war is a recurring theme in United States history, dating back to the American Revolution itself. Throughout our story, we've seen examples of controversy over participation in foreign wars. Among the most controversial were the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and, of course, Vietnam. And the United States' status as a global power means we will always have international rivals, countries with whom we feature conflicting ideologies, economic interests, or sometimes both. But should it be standard operating procedure for the United States to try and undermine and outmaneuver these rivals? Or should we dedicate resources to the preservation of peace despite our differences? In the 1970s, the United States underwent a slight paradigm shift, abandoning the aggressive posturing of the first 3 decades of the Cold War. But did this new emphasis on coexistence make the world safer? Should it be the model to which we strive? Let's take a look. Our first big idea traces the causes of détente in the 1970s. Détente, the easing of tensions between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War, was brought on by the disaster in Vietnam and a global economic downturn in the 1970s. The overarching foreign policy theme of the 1970s is détente, a French term that describes the easing of tensions or hostilities. As we already know, tensions between the United States and USSR rose steadily in the early stages of the Cold War. A lack of cooperation between the two in the 1940s caused a standoff in Germany, and nuclear proliferation further aroused suspicion in the 50s. The Vietnam War dominated the late 60s, but by the turn of the 1970s, it became clear that the unwavering commitment to containment was unsustainable. Under President Richard Nixon, the United States withdrew from Southeast Asia, and the circumstances in Vietnam had mostly eroded public appetite for military intervention in the name of containment. And while communism did spread into South Vietnam and later Cambodia, the domino effect did not appear to pose a real threat to the United States or its allies. The failure in Vietnam thus softened the ground for the United States to take less adversarial positions against communist interests for the duration of the 1970s. Another significant cause of détente was a global economic downturn that was highlighted by the oil shock of 1973. Now, following World War II, global demand for oil continued to skyrocket, and Arab nations of the Middle East joined the US, Canada, and Venezuela as major producers. But after the United States supported Israel in its 1973 war with Egypt, the oil producers of the Arab world levied an oil embargo on Israel's allies, the United States included. The action produced an oil shortage worldwide that had ripple effects throughout the entire American economy. The resulting economic downturn provided the pretext for the US government and the Soviet Union to reduce their military spending and look for more amicable ways of dealing with one another. So, with the appetite for détente established, let's take a look at the foreign policy decisions of the 1970s. Here's our second big idea. Détente during the 1970s was highlighted by normalizing relations with communist China, the acceptance of communism in Eastern Europe, and the reduction of nuclear armaments. The three American presidents of the 1970s, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, each contributed to the reduction of Cold War tensions. Nixon, of course, oversaw the end of American involvement in Vietnam, which represented an end to America's active military commitment to the containment policy. Nixon also turned heads in 1972 when he opened commercial and diplomatic relations with communist China. Nixon even became the first president to visit China while in office. While the move was unpopular with hardline opponents of communism, the robust trade relationship the United States now maintains with China is largely a product of these initial gestures in the early 70s. Later in 1972, Nixon achieved another victory for Detente with the first Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, also known as SALT I. The SALT I treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union resulted in a reduction of nuclear-capable ICBMs on both sides. And while both the US and USSR retained enough nuclear power to destroy humanity several times over, SALT I was a symbolic victory that paved the way for a reduction in the conventional arms race as well. Gerald Ford took office in 1974 under unusual circumstances after the Watergate scandal forced the resignation of Richard Nixon. But Ford's short tenure witnessed the continuation of Detente. In August 1975, Ford signed on to the Helsinki Accords, along with Canada and every European nation, including the Soviet Union. The Accords included an agreement among Western Bloc nations to accept the geopolitical status quo in Europe. In other words, the United States and Western Europe acknowledged the legitimacy of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, and they agreed not to interfere or undermine political processes in that region. The Accords required concessions on both sides, and legitimizing communism was a difficult pill to swallow for many Americans, but it did permit both sides to breathe a little easier with certain assurances from the other. In 1976, in the wake of Watergate, American voters turned back to the Democratic Party and elected Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Carter's presidency focused on a number of foreign policy issues, mainly concerning the Middle East, but Carter did lend his hand to Detente through the Second SALT Treaty, which further reduced nuclear delivery systems between the US and USSR. As a result of Detente in the 70s, American foreign policy focused less on the Cold War and more on issues in the Middle East. This is our final big idea. The Carter administration witnessed increased American attention in the Middle East. Activities there were highlighted by the Camp David Accords and the Iran hostage crisis. The easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union allowed the US to focus more policy attention elsewhere. And during the Carter administration, the Middle East took center stage. American involvement in the Middle East dates back to the late 1940s, when President Truman became the first world leader to recognize the Jewish state of Israel. Arab nations of the Middle East opposed Israel's creation, and a number of hot wars broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbors in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Throughout these turbulent decades, the United States proved a steady ally for the Israelis. The two nations were united both by their democratic political system as well as the Judeo-Christian tradition. But in the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter played a significant role in easing tension between Israel and its neighbors when he hosted Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at the Camp David retreat in Maryland. Carter helped to mediate the Camp David Accords, which laid important groundwork for negotiations that soon led to Arab recognition of Israel and a cooling of tempers in the region. The agreement was the biggest foreign policy success of Carter's presidency. But Carter's diplomatic victory at Camp David was soon overshadowed by a crisis in Iran. Between 1953 and 1979, Iran featured an autocratic government that was supported by Western powers, including the United States. But the westernization of Iran inspired contempt among conservative Shia Muslims, who favored a government rooted in the Islamic tradition. In 1979, Islamic fundamentalists led by the Ayatollah Khomeini seized power in the country and began enforcing strict religious laws. The United States, representative as it was of westernization, was a natural enemy of the new regime. And in November 1979, the United States Embassy in Tehran was seized by Iranian militants, and more than 50 Americans were held hostage there. Carter attempted to secure their freedom a number of times, but none of the efforts succeeded. Most famously, he authorized Operation Eagle Claw, a disastrous rescue mission that resulted in the loss of 8 U.S. soldiers and 6 military helicopters. Ultimately, Carter's failure to free the hostages in Iran tarnished his presidency and opened the door for Republican Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. But that will be a topic for another day. For now, let's circle back to the big question. Should we work to defeat our adversaries or coexist with them? In an increasingly complicated geopolitical climate, this question remains a relevant one, and the 1970s provides an appropriate case study. The efforts that produced Detente in the 70s decreased America's military presence around the world, saving the lives of an untold number of American soldiers. The slowing of the nuclear arms race, the result of the SALT treaties, allowed the United States and Soviet Union to breathe a little easier, and the threat of nuclear war faded significantly. Of course, this is not to suggest that military intervention should be avoided at any cost. The world can be a treacherous place, and it would be folly to pretend that America doesn't have enemies determined to see her fail. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the atrocities committed by Nazis in Europe demanded action. So too did the attacks on September 11th, 2001. But maybe the 70s shows us that economic and ideological rivals are best handled more conservatively. Perhaps even when worldviews seem incompatible, we can still find common ground. Next time, we'll look at American politics and society during the 1970s. See you then.